So today's message is titled Vivification, the Paradox of Pain. Vivification, the Paradox of Pain. And we're not going to be going through all, 13 chapters of Genesis. We're just going to take some portions of the scriptures this morning. But we're going to actually be looking through the eyes of pain, through the eyes of Joseph. And before I begin, though, I do want to start off with this very important question for your life. And that is your pain a prison, or could it be a pathway? Is your pain a prison, or could it be a pathway? So very recently, I actually came across a very interesting fact about the human brain. There's actually something very mysterious about how our brain handles pain. Did y'all know that when your brain actually processes pain for the rest of your body, it doesn't actually immediately distinguish between physical and emotional pain? So say you're actually a young man, and say your girlfriend breaks up with you. At the same time, though, she punches you in the arm very, very hard, all right? The way that your brain processes that is it processes both emotional and physical pain through the same neural pathway, amplifying the experience of pain. And so pain is pain, whether it's a broken arm, whether it's betrayal, a loss of a family member, or isolation. Pain actually registers the same whether it's physical or emotional within your brain. And today's passage is about a man who has registered deep emotional pain the majority of his life. And again, just as the brain kind of registers emotional pain as deeply as physical pain, Joseph's story actually shows us what happens when pain gets buried for decades. However, what's very ironic, though, is that Joseph, on the outside, his life looks prosperous and it looks thriving. In fact, Joseph was exalted to the highest position within the Egyptian government. And he was given authority and he was given honor. And his fame was actually renowned across the nation he was over. But it wasn't actually until we actually read in chapter 45, toward the end of Joseph's story, when we pick up on the emotional bullet that Joseph has actually been carrying his entire life. And it's not until chapter 45 when we realize that this bullet was actually not visible, but has always been present with him. And what I find actually very illuminating about Joseph's story is that actually it reveals a pattern. It reveals a pattern that maybe many Christians, possibly maybe you or myself, often follow as we walk with God. And that is this pattern. And the pattern is pain buried, pain released, and finally pain redeemed. Pain buried, pain released, and finally pain redeemed. And when you read the story of Joseph, you will read that Joseph finally is presented this opportunity to release his pain. And while at the same time he releases his pain, he realizes his pain is actually a pathway for something greater. And thus, this is the question for you all today. Is your pain a prison, or could it be a pathway? Now, where I'd like to actually start reading this morning is out of chapter 45, starting in verse 1. And I think you're going to actually see why. And it says this. It says, "And then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' And when they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near to me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that you have. I'll provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who's speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded to me in Egypt, and about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. And all God's people said, amen. Have y'all ever thought about the fact that when Joseph was thrown into prison, after he was wrongly accused of making advances on this Egyptian officer's wife, the officer was named Potiphar, that this was actually, in fact, the second prison that Joseph was thrown into. You see, his first prison was the prison of emotional trauma inflicted to him by his very own brothers who betrayed him and sold him into slavery. You see, this very act of betrayal by family, especially in the ancient culture where kinship was so sacred, would have been emotionally devastating for Joseph. And how do we know that Joseph's emotional trauma deeply affected him? It's actually because if you were actually to flip from this chapter in chapter 45 and you go to chapter 50, 5 chapters later, at the very, very end of Joseph's story, and you read from when Joseph's father, Jacob, he dies, you can actually further see what is actually going on in Joseph's heart. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants of God, of your father. When their message came to Joseph, Joseph wept. You see, even after his family comes to Egypt finally, and they stay with him for a while, when Joseph's pain point gets touched, he still weeps again. Now, to be honest with y'all, I've read this story of Joseph many, many times in my life. And honestly, I've never keyed in on the pain that Joseph carried throughout his story. And it wasn't actually until very recently that I started to key in on Joseph's pain. And the reason was because, at the end of August, I, along with Lewis and Sharon Shepard and Don Chang, we all were given the opportunity to go to South Africa to give messages and to give seminars at the South African House Church Shepherds Conference there. And it was just overall an amazing experience for us four. And I think I could say that for all of us, that this trip was super life-changing. And I think for me specifically, I can honestly say that this trip left an indelible mark on my life. Me going to South Africa left such a deep impression on me that I think that my perspective from now on is going to be forever changed. And I think the best way to describe this trip for me is by stating that this trip was a trip of seeing. A trip of seeing. Sometimes God wants to take you somewhere to see. He wants to actually take you somewhere to see what he sees. And sometimes it's hard to see what God sees, and to see from a different perspective other than our very own. And mission trips often do this for us. When we go on mission trips, they do this. We see what God sees. And I think the best way to describe this South African trip was through this trip, I think I finally got to see through the eyes of God his view of pain. Because there in South Africa, I saw people in deep pain. The pain of poverty, the pain of violence, the pain of rape, the pain of incest, the pain of abandonment from their fathers, the pain of mourning for a dying family member. You name it, And that pain was represented in that group of the South African shepherds, of which we shared our messages and testimonies with. In fact, one of the pastor couple's wives who hosted us there, she was telling us about how bad the violence has gotten in South Africa recently. And she was telling me about her family, and they lived in this kind of rougher part of town. And some men broke into her home while her children were home, and the parents were actually out doing ministry. And their son at the time was at the age of 12 years old, and this was recent, and he's about my daughter's age. And they put a gun to all the children's head. They tied the children up in a chair. They threw a carpet over them, and they ransacked their house. And I don't know if you can imagine that happening to your children, but this is what happened to one of the pastor couple's children there in South Africa. And as their son, was at this retreat, he was having these traumatic episodes from this incident still today. And this is just one of many examples that we heard while we were there. And we heard so many stories at the conference of people's pain, because the theme of the conference was the same theme as our own North America Shepherds Conference, the pain of God and the love of God. You know, what Lewis, Sharon, and Don and I experienced and what we witnessed there were people who had pain so deeply embedded in their souls that some of them just wept so loudly, like Joseph weeps in front of his brothers here in chapter 45. And actually, through my experience in South Africa, coupled with this story of Joseph, I saw something through the eyes of God that I had been blinded to, I think, for years, for myself and for other people. And you see, what I saw with all of us, including you and me in this room, that we are actually all on a very similar story arc as Joseph in the Bible. We all have our own stories of pain buried, pain released. And now, hopefully, God is working a path for our pain to be redeemed. And Joseph's story here actually helped me kind of process my thoughts and organize my thoughts around pain. You see, the first thing that I learned about pain in South Africa is about pain buried. Pain buried. You know, pain can get buried so deep in the recesses of our soul that it often holds us captive in our own prison. Pain gets buried so deep in the recesses of our soul that often it holds us captive in our own prison. And actually, if you start looking at verse 1 of Genesis 45, we read this: "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard, and Pharaoh's household heard all about it." You see, the reason why we know that Joseph's pain was buried so deep was because he commands everyone to actually leave the room, all but his brothers. And Joseph doesn't just, get, teary-eyed in his eyes. He lets out a loud cry. In fact, if you look in the Hebrew, it could be rendered this: Joseph gave his voice in weeping, and Egypt heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. So Joseph's pain was lodged so deeply that when his pain was finally released, his cry was heard not only in the house of Pharaoh, but it was heard further in Egypt. This means that he was letting out a strong cry. When we were actually in South Africa, at the conference, there was actually a lot of joy and there was a lot of dancing during our time there. And one of the pastors, he turned to me while there was this dancing going on, and he told me this. He says, we as Africans, we dance when we're happy, we dance when we're sad, and we dance when we're angry. And I said, really? He said, yeah, we dance when we're angry. The reason is because we hold so much pain inside that we have to somehow let it out. Well, at the end of the session of both nights, there was this dedicated time of prayer for us. And on the second night, after Lewis and Sharon shared their testimonies in the late afternoon, and I got to share my message in the evening, during the prayer time, many people came to the front to receive prayer. They came to the stage, And some of them just cried and they wept before the Lord. And we could feel this deep hurt that was embedded in these people's soul that these South Africans were carrying. And there was this one man who had a body like a bodybuilder. He reminded me of Daniel Alexander there in the back. He had his kind of body, right? He was big. I'm just going to call him Tom. I was going to call him Daniel, but I decided to call him Tom to change the name. Tom is real tall. He's strong and he's fit. And Tom was super healthy and very put together. And I heard that Tom actually had been working out, just recently. He had run so much that he lost so much weight, and he lifted a bunch of weight, and so he just looked very cut and built. Well, Tom, he comes up to the front of the stage at the end of the session, and as I'm praying for him, Tom starts praying, and then ever so slowly, Tom begins to fall backwards. And so I'm telling him, Tom, hey, you got to be careful. You got to sit down. Why don't you sit down? You're going to fall backwards, and you're going to hurt yourself. But he cannot hear me at all. He just completely starts to fall backwards. And luckily, there was this guy that was standing nearby, a South African named Hector. He was in our proximity. He sees me and he sees Tom, and he comes running to us. And he actually helps me to lay Tom, flat on his back. And then Tom, as he's laying flat on his back, he starts to wail with this deep, emotional crying that's just so deep within his heart. And his face, turns into that ugly cry. You know what I'm saying? And that pain was just coming out deep within him. Well, he starts crying for about 5 to 10 minutes of this continual weeping. And then all of a sudden, Tom gets up and he looks at me and he smiles. And he says, thank you. And he gets up and he walks right back to his desk or his chair where he was sitting. And he didn't tell us anything what's going on through that whole experience. And that experience was so personal. It was, private. And it was like a silent healing session for Tom that words could not describe. And Tom was just one of many, many men who came to the front, fully grown men, and cried out to the Lord and sobbed to the Lord, releasing their pain that was so buried in them. And through this incident, this gave me an image of how Joseph must have cried. Joseph's cry revealed such a deep pain and emotion that was in the well of his soul. And more, than Tom, Joseph cries out so loud that Egypt heard his cry. And not only Pharaoh's household. And I realized there in South Africa that for many of us, just like Joseph and Tom, sometime in your life, you've been shot with a bullet. A bullet of pain has been lodged into you for years. It's been deeply buried within you and possibly maybe even forgotten. Did you know how long Joseph carried his bullet of pain? Joseph carried his bullet of pain for 22 years. 22 years. Joseph was 17 years old when he was initially betrayed by his brothers, selling him into slavery. Joseph would have spent 10 to 12 years in prison after being accused of advancing on Potiphar's wife. And finally, when Joseph was taken out of prison, 7 years of prosperity and 2 years of famine, while actually he's ruler over all of Egypt as prime minister, he would have actually been 39 years old when his brothers actually come before him and bow before him. And so 22 years, Joseph has been carrying his bullet of pain. And even at the end of his story, actually in chapter 50, Joseph still weeps. What is the bullet of pain you've been carrying for years? And how many years has your bullet been lodged within you? And maybe for you, like Joseph, externally, it seems like there's nothing to cry about. Remember, Joseph in chapter 45, Joseph is at the height of a nation. Everything's going well for Joseph on the outside. He lacks nothing. He's actually living quite well. He's given a wife. He has children. He's probably living in a nice palace. He's probably eating every day a buffet brought by the Egyptians to him. But no power, no wealth, no honor, no position could assuage his pain, Joseph's pain. So maybe, just maybe, like Joseph, it seems as though everything's going pretty good in your life right now. You know, crying out to God seems like a luxury, possibly, because you live in luxury. You have a roof over your head. You're not worried about your next meal. You have a decent job. You go to a decent school. You are traveling the world. You've got a lot of friends. Maybe you have friends in very high places, possibly. Your life seems pretty in order, just like Joseph's life was in order in Egypt. However, when the time comes to present itself, no power, no luxury, no honor can hold the pain that's buried deep inside you. Is there a bullet that is lodged deep within you, which you've been carrying for a long period of time, like Joseph? And how many years have you been carrying your bullet? And are you praying for the day that God redeems you from your pain? I learned in South Africa about pain buried. The second thing I learned about pain through our trip in South Africa is pain released. Pain released. You know, releasing our pain takes God's wisdom, not victimization nor man-made control. Releasing our pain takes God's wisdom, not victimization nor man-made control. Now, I'm going to assume that Joseph is going to get triggered with his pain when he first sees his brothers arriving to Egypt. Because if you actually go back 3 chapters, you go back to chapter 42, and you actually read the very first encounter with his brothers in Egypt. The text says this: "Now Joseph was governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. When Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. 'Where do you come from?' he asked. 'From the land of Canaan,' they replied, 'to buy food.'" Now, let me ask you all a question. If your siblings sold you into slavery, and they show up at your house looking to get food from you because they're in need, how do you think you would reply? Would you lash out at them? Would you seek revenge? Would you immediately throw them into the prison for all the pain that they've caused you? And what if your siblings said this to you? "Your servants are not spies, but are honest men." How would you feel? In fact, Joseph's brothers says twice to Joseph in verse 11 and again in verse 31 in this chapter of 42 that they are honest men. You know, for me, the minute that I heard these words, "we're honest men," I would have pulled the Mission Impossible on them. I would have just ripped off my mask, you know, like Tom Cruise does in the movies, you know. I would have taken off all my Egyptian garb and it said, "Honest men? Really? Honest men? Are you kidding me? Honest men? How can you say you're honest men?" That's exactly what I've done. But what's very interesting about Joseph is that although he initially deals with his pain with some harshness, he ultimately surrenders to God's wisdom. He surrenders to God's wisdom. And we know that Joseph surrenders to God's wisdom because in verse 9 of chapter 42, the text says this: "Joseph remembers his dream." Joseph remembers his dream. And Joseph remembered the dreams of his brothers coming to bow before him in verse 9. And then later in verse 18, we read this: "Joseph said to them, 'Do this and you'll live, for I fear God.'" I fear God. And you have to know that this phrase, "for I fear God," is the phrase that's often used over and over in scriptures. It points to true wisdom, true wisdom. For example, Proverbs 9:10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The fear of the Lord. And instead of just lashing out at his brothers, Joseph, he devised a plan to get his younger brother to come to Egypt. And then he continues to say to his brothers, "If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take your grain back to your family and your household." And so Joseph, he devises a plan to get his brother back with the same plan almost that his brothers did to him 22 years prior. And listen to this. If you actually jump down to verse 24 of the same chapter in chapter 42, you see Joseph's pain starting to be released. He turned away from them, and he began to weep. You know, Joseph could have gone into victimization mode and just unleashed on all his brothers when they came to him. And then he could actually just taken control into his own hands by himself and just thrown his brothers into prison. He could have sent teams of chariots to go and receive his father and bring back his younger brother. But Joseph, he responds in fear of the Lord. And he remembers his dreams from 22 years ago. And Joseph, what we see here is that he releases his pain with a response of God's wisdom. You know, when you have a bullet that's shot in you that you have not released, the coping mechanisms for yourself can actually turn quite ugly. And as you've been carrying your bullet, you've learned subconsciously to kind of maybe cope with your pain that you have in you. Meaning, if your bullet of pain was shot in your left arm, then you at the same time, simultaneously, you've learned to use your right arm in order to compensate. And most coping mechanisms, they go in one of two sinful directions: victimization and control. Victimization and control. Victimization is woe is me, and it tends to kind of navel gaze at the bullet inside of you. Victimization blames all your past experiences on your past, and it brings it right into the present. Control is I'm going to deal with my pain myself versus surrendering it in fear of the Lord. And both are extremely tiring. Both victimization and control, extremely tiring. Aren't you tired when you're in the mode of victimization? And aren't you tired when you're in the position of control, controlling your pain? Always, trying to control. Maybe possibly with victimization, you're always trying to find out how the bullet has affected you. And with control, you tend to maybe trying to medicate yourself. You're trying to fight, or maybe trying to take the bullet out yourself. And over the years, when I think about my own coping mechanisms for my own personal pain, I realized, especially when I was in South Africa, that I always resorted to control. I want to control my situation, so my pain point doesn't ever get touched again. It's better to actually bury that pain and forget about it and never touch it again. And so when my pain point actually gets close to being touched, my response I turn to is deflection, and I turn to fighting or arguing so that I can avoid that pain point getting touched. And I've realized over the years that the only restful place to be is actually in the operating room, waiting in surrender for the great physician to come and to do surgery on me. And these verses in Jeremiah 30:17 are very helpful. But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord. Psalms 147:3, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Isaiah 53:5, by his wounds we are healed. And in the last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 22:2 reveals what the tree of life does for us. The tree of life is for your healing. The tree of life is for your healing. One of the fruits that we experienced at the South African House Church Shepherds Conference was that we learned not to give ourselves over to victimization, but actually to release our pain to our great physician, our Lord. We learned this phrase: don't cry, but cry out. Don't cry, but cry out to God. When we cry out to God, this is lamenting. It's called lamenting in the Bible. Lamenting is not just crying, but lamenting is crying out to the Lord to be our great physician. And crying out to the Lord is this is wisdom. This is fear of the Lord. And so there in South Africa, one sister who came up to me, she confessed that she had not realized that this pain that she had was buried so deep, so lodged within her, that her coping mechanism actually had been victimization. She learned to cope with victimization, and she realized that this is not the way she needs to be with God. I realized as she told me this, that victimization would be our only resort if we didn't have God. Amen? It would be our only resort if we didn't have God in our life. And Joseph shows us there's another pathway, whereas we can release our pain rightly with wisdom. He fears God, and he works to devise a plan not to harm, but to save. And that's what's amazing. And actually, this brings me to the last thing I learned about pain in South Africa. And that is, pain redeems. Pain redeemed. You see, pain redeemed is pain that is overcome with forgiveness versus vengeance in order to bring about God's bigger picture, the saving of lives. Pain redeemed is pain that is overcome with forgiveness versus vengeance in order to bring about God's bigger picture, the saving of lives. You know, actually, what's very helpful for me, and what I think would be very helpful for all of us, is to have an image of a drone in your mind. You all know a drone with a video camera. You have an image of a drone. And when that drone is low, and this drone is actually flying around people, videotaping people, people actually hurting other people, it really is videotaping people with their own choices and their own will, hurting other people. This is what the drone sees. So if you actually got hurt by another person, it is really the hurt and the pain of other people that caused you to feel pain in your life, whether either intentionally or unintentionally. However, when the drone is actually pulled high in the sky, there is a bigger picture that God is putting together. God is working, and he's working all things out for the good, so that the bigger picture will result in the saving of lives. So is it God who is actually doing the hurting of the people? The answer is an emphatic no. God does not do the hurting of people. But when the drone is taken high, there is just this other perspective. A perspective that God is weaving everything together for a bigger picture. That is the saving of lives. And this is why I've realized that pain is a paradox. Pain is a paradox. Because pain is extremely painful when the drone is down low, near our faces. And this is why Joseph weeps with a weeping that he cannot contain, and he lets out so all of Egypt can hear. But when the drone is actually taken high, our pain is part of this bigger story. That is the saving of lives by God. So pain is a paradox. Your pain is extremely painful, but your pain through God can actually have a bigger picture. Your pain was caused by people, but your pain can be for people the redemption by God himself. And how can I actually make this claim? How am I so sure of this, that pain is a paradox? The reason I'm so confident about this is because of this, the cross. The cross is this epitome. It's the symbol of the paradox of pain. You see, Jesus took the pain of the world. And when you take a drone and you look at Jesus' face while he's dying on the cross, it's extremely painful for him. But when you take the drone up high and you see what God is weaving together, Jesus, through the cross, is actually the saving of lives. And this is why, when you actually read chapter 50, you can actually see Jesus in the story of Joseph. And this is how Joseph actually handles his pain in chapter 50. It says this, his brothers then came and threw themselves before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of lives. So then don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your children, and be reassured by them." He reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. Is this not the story of Jesus in the story of Joseph? And the part that I actually find fascinating about Joseph is when he says, "Don't be afraid, am I in the place of God? I first see, Joseph, he humbles himself before the Lord. Am I in the place of God? Joseph could have taken all his authority, all his honor, all the power that he was given by God in Egypt to actually execute vengeance and wrath on his brothers. But actually, he still humbles himself before the Lord. And secondly, Joseph does not give into the victimization narrative, but rather, like Jesus, he elevates his narrative to God's narrative. You intended to harm me. Joseph could have easily stayed on that narrative for the rest of his life. You intended to harm me. Joseph could have kept the drone so down low on his face and just videotaped that part and replayed that videotape over and over to his brothers. And that would have kept Joseph in his prison, and that would have pulled all his brothers into his prison with him. But Joseph, he elevates the narrative. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of lives. Joseph elevates his story to a pathway for God. Isn't that amazing? So Joseph, he's actually a pointer to Jesus, who will actually elevate the perspective of God. So do you guys know when Jesus is on the cross and they're nailing him to the cross and he's sitting on the cross, what does Jesus say? He says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." As he's hanging on the cross, he makes his pain a pathway for God. Amen? The saving of lives. That's what the cross is about. And I think what was so amazing on this trip to South Africa for me, for Lewis and for Sharon, for Don and myself, we all experienced, as well as some of the African house church shepherds there, that there is a way for our pain to be a pathway for something greater, a pathway for redemption. And I believe that this trip for us, God wanted us to see. He wanted us to see people in deep pain, the changing of the narrative of their stories to be like Joseph, who is ultimately a pointer to Jesus, although who went through excruciating pain himself, but he places himself in God's saving narrative. I actually want to end with a story. And this is a story of a person who I think is kind of like a Joseph. And the reason why I say that is because on the outside, he looks pretty put together. But this man is Horatio Spafford. And he wrote the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," which was actually born out of unimaginable grief and unimaginable trust in God. Spafford was actually a very successful lawyer in Chicago, and he was a very devout Christian. And he and his wife, Anna, were very close friends with Dwight L. Moody. And so they knew Moody very well. And they had children. But then, tragedy struck their lives. In 1870, their four-year-old son died of scarlet fever. And then 1 year later, in 1871, a great Chicago fire just destroyed their home and destroyed all their investments. In 1873, 2 years later, after he was trying to seek some rest, Spafford, he sent his wife and his children, all 4 daughters, on a ship to England. But the ship, as it was going to England, collided into another ship. And the ship actually ended up sinking in 12 minutes. All 4 children died in that ship. Only his wife made it on that ship. And 200 other people died with his 4 daughters. His wife, Anna, actually survived, and she made it to England, and she wrote him. She sent a telegraph from Wales, "Saved alone. What should I do?" And as Spafford sailed to reunite with his wife, the captain said, "Hey, this was the place where the ship actually went down." And then he actually was overcome with so much emotion. And he went back into his cabin, and he began to pen the words, "It is well with my soul," to release his pain. I believe that there is only one way Horatio Spafford could release his pain in this way. He must have saw a bigger picture from God. That's the only way for him to release his pain in this way. but writing the hymn, "It is well with my soul." Is your pain a prison? Or is your pain a pathway for God? Let's pray together.